Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here and speak to this group. I've certainly enjoyed the conference for this time and the previous time, and glad to speak. This actually, I think, is an interesting follow-on talk to the discussion we've just had, in that the Secure Beef Supply Plan in the U.S. is essentially an attempt to elevate the biosecurity and management practices of operations so that we can allow movements and at the same time try to decrease the risk of spreading disease. So there are a number of secure food supply plans in the U.S., secure pork, secure milk, and this is the Secure Beef Supply Plan, which is particularly associated with that industry segment. There's really 4 parts of the plan in general. I'm going to talk about 3 of them: managed movement, biosecurity, and surveillance. And the last one, managing infected premises, I'll leave alone for today for time reasons. So really the onus for beginning to think about these supply plans was the desire to be able to control an outbreak of FMD in the U.S. without destroying the industry in the process. While an FMD outbreak would be terrible and very disruptive to the industry, it's possible that the cure could be worse than the disease. And so we wanted to avoid that. And try to facilitate animal movement and business continuity as much as we can without elevating the risk of FMD transmission. So I should point out that these are guidance documents, and USDA or the state animal health officials are not bound by anything that's in these documents, and anything I say here today is also not policy, but my opinion, probably. So there is a very extensive livestock movement network in the U.S., and so very quickly we could spread FMD all over the country. This here is just an actual collected network of beef cattle movements in the U.S., just a state-to-state network. So there's been a lot of talk about one of the things that may happen in just to try and get the outbreak under control, or at least have some time to figure out where all it is an initial just 72-hour stop movement. Nationwide, all species, nothing may move for up to 72 hours. USDA has talked about that some. Some state officials have essentially committed that they will do that. Certainly at the beginning of an outbreak, there will be control areas established around infected premises, and then movement restrictions will be put in place there. And it may be then days to weeks before there's enough confidence about what's going on that there's sufficient knowledge to allow movements that aren't too risky. So at some point, though, we will want to restart movement. If we're going to have any kind of business continuity, we've got to start movement again. The industries around the world are dependent upon some cattle movement. So within these control areas, that movement will be limited. And so we've developed some draft guidelines for how do we control movement, how do we manage it such that we limit the amount of risk that is transmitted from one place to another. So one of the ways that we'll want to do that is with enhanced biosecurity. So essentially we want to keep FMD off of non-infected operations, and we want to keep it on those that are already infected. So we've developed some biosecurity plans, and there are both templates for feedlots to fill out, as well as guidance documents for them to build an enhanced biosecurity plan. Similarly, we have the same thing for cattle on pasture. Now, these are generally not the sorts of things that we would expect an operation or a premises to implement when there isn't FMD in the country. They are enhanced biosecurity. Some of them are just good practices. Some of them are things that we'd only do in an outbreak. But they give producers guidelines for what to plan for, and they give them a plan to implement now. So they've already made the plan, if FMD comes, they just have to implement it. So some of the issues, one is, as a general guideline, it's the producer's responsibility to keep FMD off of the premises. So that involves, in our recommendations, developing a site-specific biosecurity plan. So these aren't very generic. The main issues are laid out, but how they're implemented in an individual operation varies. So we suggest that they identify a biosecurity officer that's going to be responsible for the development of the plan and the ultimate implementation of it, and highly recommend that they consult with their veterinarian in setting that up. And one of the things that involves is what we've called a line of separation, just a line literally drawn on the map around the premises where the animals are located. And the goal is that that's to some extent a psychological line that makes them think about outside of the premises versus inside of the premises and how to control that barrier. So we don't want anything to cross that line of separation that could introduce virus without cleaning and disinfection. So this is just a little schematic of a line of separation in red drawn around a feedlot. And you can also see down here in the lower left a little blow up of the place in this where cattle are be delivered and or either arrive or be shipped out. And in this case, we've got an entry point here for a truck that can come in and not cross the line of separation, back up to a loading dock and load cattle or load cattle up without the truck ever crossing the line of separation. Then we don't have to clean and disinfect the truck. That helps, I think, the producer think about how do I just maintain inside versus outside? And it helps us avoid washing as many trucks. Now, obviously, this point couldn't be back here in the middle of the feed yard where we've driven by half of the cattle on the way in and we just drew a line to make it safe. That doesn't work, but if it's on the periphery like this, it can be helpful, I think, to both control how much effort has to go into cleaning and disinfecting and to keep things on the outside. So from a surveillance standpoint, we also need to work on some things to try and identify FMD if it is on a premises. So good surveillance demonstrates a lack of evidence of FMD. So we want daily cattle monitoring, and that needs to be done by trained personnel. So I'll talk in a moment about some training things that we've developed. That may include farm inspections by responsible regulatory officials. And if it were available, it could include laboratory testing. At this time, we really don't have a method by which we could test large numbers of feedlot cattle in a practical sort of way. But the goal of this surveillance is some increased confidence that if we allow a shipment to happen, that it will be at least safer. So in order to do that, the producers need to be prepared. And so if they're going to do surveillance or monitoring of the cattle on the yard for FMD, then they need to know what the signs of FMD are. And so we need to sharpen up their recognition skills and train specific cattle health monitors. And feed yards are what we call cowboys that actually go and look at the cattle every day. You know, all of the cattle in the lot are looked at every day for sickness. And so all we need to do is make sure that they know what FMD looks like and they will promptly report it. Combined with that is written records of those observations so that they can serve as documentation that the cattle have been looked at, that they have either remained healthy or that signs have been noticed that are consistent with FMD. Then we want good record keeping of animal movements on and off of the operation, feed supply movements on and off of the operation, largely for the purposes of being able to detect potential risky movements. If we could look at movement movement records and recognize that they have received cattle from a dangerous contact, then that changes everything. And so we now look at this as a risky feedlot and anything from it a risky movement. On the opposite end, if they show that all of their movements have not been with any sorts of risky contacts, then that supports that perhaps this feed yard is indeed still negative. And then they need to establish some biosecurity plans, as we've talked, that allow them to try and minimize the introduction of any virus through trucks, feed, or that sort of thing. So here are, there's a little booklet we've got that just has pictures of foot and mouth disease in dairy and beef cattle, some posters, as well as some signage for establishing biosecure entry points. So in the end, the goal of this is to allow some at least better method of identifying what are lower risk movements. So if they have good traceability information, we know where they've received cattle from and where they've received feed shipments from. If they have good biosecurity practices in place so that there isn't just free movement on and off of the premises. If they have good epidemiology information, again related to arrivals and departures from the operation. And if in all of that, through all of this monitoring and biosecurity, if there's no evidence of infection, then we may feel comfortable in providing a permit for a particular group of cattle on this operation to be able to move, whether it's to slaughter or just to the next phase of production. Now, this doesn't provide solid evidence that there is no infection. It's just a system that can provide no evidence of infection. Maybe a subtle distinction, but it's sort of the negative as opposed to positive evidence. We've just looked hard and we failed to find any reason to think that this operation is positive, and so we believe it's a low-risk shipment. If we don't have all this information, then we just think it's an undefined risk shipment and we probably would prohibit it. Operations that have developed these programs in advance can implement them quickly and they'll be more quickly able to move animals. And so that's sort of the carrot in the program. So that's in very short. The program as it is, the website here, securebeef.org, is if you have interest and want to look at more, there's all of the materials are available there. There's also, if you go just Google secure food supply plans, you can find the all of the supply plans at the Center for Food Security and Public Health at Iowa State University, which is the other collaborator on this. They really are the lead institution, have done a great deal of work on this and on all the other plans. So with that, I'll take any questions and just thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mike.